Does everything look good?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to everyone for showing up for my presentation today. So at least some of you will be familiar with me in my capacity as a paleontologist, where oftentimes I'm waxing poetic about big dead amphibians and their anatomy and systematics, and the data for which usually end up on MorphoBank. So I don't know where exactly I rank in the power users list for MorphoBank, but I have at least 10 projects, so I got to be somewhere up near the top in terms of the most frequent users. But I'm actually not going to be talking about my paleontological work today. I'm putting on my day job hat in my capacity as a research data librarian at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm going to be talking about something that hopefully will be relevant, or I will attempt to convince people is relevant to you, regardless of where you kind of are situated in the research ecosystem, whether you're a researcher or you work for a data repository or a museum or what have you. And so everything that I'm going to talk about today is really under this umbrella concept, I think, of expanding the concept data reuse and what that means, and then why that should matter to everyone. And so, in the next 10 or so minutes, what I hope to communicate to everybody are really sort of these 3 points. The first one being that everyone should care about data sets having standardized, centralized, publicly accessible affiliation metadata, or in general, discipline agnostic metadata that isn't specific to paleontology or morphology, for example. That truly fair data are only possible with high quality discipline agnostic metadata. And third, that it's relatively easy to create and support high quality discipline agnostic metadata, much easier than it is to support discipline specific metadata or data standards. And why I think that this means that specialist repositories like MorphoBank are really well positioned, I think, in this sort of evolution of data scholarship and best practices to really be leading in that direction, even though they're not always the highest profile platforms in the broader research data repository landscape. So the FAIR principles that underline best practices around research data management, the notion that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, are really rooted in under this umbrella of trying to maximize the reusability of data. And so typically what researchers are thinking about in this capacity is reuse by other researchers in their same discipline. So this could be work that I do, for example, expanding existing phylogenetic matrices that exist in MorphoBank or elsewhere, doing reproducibility checks, either doing peer review or after a paper's been published. And these are sort of the canonical use cases that people think about when they think about data reuse. And so as a result, a lot of discipline-specific repositories like MorphoBank have placed a huge emphasis, rightfully so, on developing standards, whether that's open discipline-appropriate data formats, so requiring character matrices to be deposited in Nexus or TNT formats versus things like Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, for example. Requiring embedded metadata, things like character names and states that if people deposit their data somewhere else, they may not be required to do, for example, and that can really reduce the reusability of data for downstream users. And discipline-specific metadata, things like unified taxonomic schemes, and harmonizing other sorts of metadata that'll be specific for certain types of data sets. And so if we think about this kind of on a gradient sense, there are always going to be these big, relatively well-known repositories like Dryad, Zenodo, OSF, or Figshare that take pretty much anything in pretty much any form from pretty much any discipline, but that really can't enforce a lot of these disciplinary metadata or data standards. And so you tend to get a lot of the low-quality data in there where people are not creating data sets or not providing data in the best forms or not with the appropriate metadata or what have you. And that's really where platforms like MorphoBank or MorphoSource or NCBI shine, because they're able to enforce and really hone in on these disciplinary standards that really increase the fairness of those data. And so these types of standards are really good because they ensure that data are going to be accessible in formats that people are used to using, that they're going to be interoperable. You can't run a palp analysis on a Microsoft Word file, for example. And that generally speaking, that they're going to be reusable. But the thing that I really want to focus in on today is that these sort of disciplinary metadata and data standards don't necessarily do a whole lot for the findability component. And this tends to be the part of the FAIR principles that gets left behind in thinking about concepts about data reuse and how to share data to sort of maximize data reuse down the line. And so one of the points that I think I really want to try to distill in this presentation today is that findability is really, in many cases, more about general discipline agnostic standards than it is about discipline specific standards. And so oftentimes a lot of researchers will say to me, why should I care about the findability of my data? Whoever's interested will just find it through the paper, which is true for other researchers. And that's true if you think that the only people who are interested in your data are other researchers who are directly trying to take those data and do something with them. But as I'll sort of illustrate in the next couple slides, there's a wide range of other potential reuse cases that everyone should really be thinking about. and take into consideration in the ways that we go about sharing data and developing infrastructure. And that in order for data to really be truly maximally findable and maximally fair, rather than just minimally fair, they have to be discoverable by both humans and machines, so both manually or through automated scripted processes, and without a priori knowledge of their existence. In other words, I could find something that I didn't necessarily know existed based on, for example, certain metadata attributes. And so I just want to offer these sort of three other potential reuse cases of data. All of these are empirical. They're not just me thinking hypothetically about things, but these are real world data reuse cases that are sort of outside of the canonical bounds of what most people think about data reuse. And so that's whether that's in different meta science aspects. These are becoming increasingly popular across disciplines, kind of looking at the ways that we do science or assessing the efficacy of, let's say, data sharing policies in journals, reused by educators in pedagogical settings, or reused by funders and institutions. And that's really the one I'm going to be focusing on today, because that relates to my work at UT Austin, which is the ability for funders and institutions to sort of track and identify affiliated or funded outputs across a wide range of repositories or journals or different platforms, depending on what the focal data set is. And so there's sort of 2 points I want to emphasize in this capacity. The first is that no one, regardless of how many Nature papers you got or whether you have tenure, can really fully predict all of the ways in which your data or anybody else's data can and will be reused. And I think paleontologists in particular should be really amenable to this idea, because people, let's say 100 years ago, collected fossils that we can now do things with that those people would never have imagined that we could do. Whether that's, high resolution computed tomography or really high quality histological sectioning, for example. These just weren't things people who were collecting specimens 100 years ago would even have thought about as a possibility. And so even for digital data, I always try to encourage people to think about this broad concept of reusability as sort of an infinite horizon as well. And so these other sorts of use cases that aren't maybe the most common, but are real demonstrated use cases, require high quality, publicly accessible general metadata. And so this is things that seem relatively simple, but I'll sort of demonstrate a lot of ways that this could go sideways. Information like authors or affiliations or keywords to really maximize and ensure findability of research data. So I mentioned I'm going to be talking specifically about institutional discovery as a reuse case. I'll briefly define what this is and then why you should care about it, even if you aren't in charge of doing this type of work or you're not at a research institution per se. So institutions are generally speaking really interested in tracking broadly research outputs, whether this is to increase their marketability or to track impact. And so historically, this has been primarily journal articles and books. But now there's increased emphasis on all sorts of different research outputs, whether those are commercializable outputs like patents and inventions. Paleontologists don't usually produce those types of things, but research data and software or preprints are other examples, I think, as well. That institutions are really interested in monitoring really broadly across all units on campus to get a sense of what the institution's collective impact is, essentially. Especially in the US, with a lot of new federal agency policies coming into play as well, a lot of institutions are very interested in monitoring compliance with this because they don't want to develop a reputation for being pretty lax in meeting different mandates that, let's say, NSF or NIH have implemented around data sharing and other public access components. You're a researcher and you're like, why should I care about this? The reason you should care about this is because your central administration is trying to get these data, and they're going to do something with those data, not saying it's a good idea or that they're doing it necessarily well. But there's pressure all the way from the top at, really, high research activity institutions to get some sort of big composite data set that can be analyzed to make big claims about, we're the highest research generating university in the state of Texas, which we are, or other sorts of, things that people are interested in for marketability and to demonstrate sort of where they rank relative to peer institutions. If you're a repository, the reason why you should care is because when we think about institutional investment or funder investment or nonprofit investment into open infrastructure, things like data repositories or preprint servers or journals, people never have enough money to go around, right? And so people want to, know that their investment is going to a place where there's going to be a demonstrated impact. And so if, for example, I don't know that anybody from UT Austin uses a certain platform or journal, why would I necessarily recommend that the library invest in that resource, for example, right? We want to make data-informed decisions about where we're making those monetary investments. And likewise, I think when I do sorts of trainings around best practices for research data management, and I'm looking for examples to demonstrate or to show off or to say, other folks on campus use this, we need to have some sort of ability to comprehensively sample what we think are affiliated data sets in this case, in order to be able to point to empirical examples and not just sort of just rely on the ones that I happen to know because I happen to be a paleontologist, because most other researchers I'm interacting with on campus are not paleontologists. And so there's three sort of different ways that institutions go about trying to find affiliated data sets or related outputs in general. The first one is to pay an exorbitant amount of money to a for-profit company, and there's a lot of problems with this. The first one being that, especially for an institution like UT Austin, we're talking like 6 figures per year. Our Scopus subscription is like $150,000 or something obscene like that. It's not a great use of money. There's bad ethics around paying for-profit companies, and for data sets in particular, the infrastructure for trying to track affiliated data sets is actually pretty bad. And so what most people are doing, and this isn't work that's just being done at UT Austin, but that there's dozens of R1 universities that have really spent a lot of time in the last couple of years working on these sort of processes, is to develop locally developed bespoke solutions that tap centralized APIs to try and find this comprehensively sample across dozens to hundreds of different platforms to either look for affiliated researchers' names, if you can get that list from HR, which is a bit of a process, or if you can't, to query the institutional name. And so the point that I really want to emphasize in this is that whether you're going through names of researchers or names of the affiliation, that's discipline agnostic metadata. It's not specific to any particular discipline. And so this findability and this capacity for this type of data reuse case is really about these more general discipline agnostic standards than it is about discipline specific standards. So I don't have time to talk about the whole process that I've developed over the last year at UT Austin. If you want to go to the GitHub account repository for this, there's like a linked preprint that's 60 pages. Sorry, I write long papers that explains the whole process and what have you. But the point is that what we're trying to do, and this is in the same vein as work that other folks are doing at other institutions, we're trying to go through the DataCite API. For folks who don't know, DataCite is the organization that mints and maintains DOIs for datasets. So in theory, it should be this centralized source of metadata for all research data sets that have been produced across most research repositories. But it's not quite that easy, and as I'll sort of demonstrate in the next couple of slides, and there's a lot of sort of problems, and we know we're missing a lot of things in there. So that kind of affects the ways in which we're able to kind of reuse these data and downstream processes. So the first thing I'll sort of mention is that affiliation is just not often recorded. I cannot do anything, looking for UT Austin affiliated data sets if UT Austin is not connected in some capacity to a data set. And so even these big repositories that get millions of dollars from NIH and other funders to purportedly do this, oftentimes are really bad at this as well. So this is not something that's exclusive to any small number of repositories. This is really a pervasive problem across the research repository landscape, is again that people are not thinking of institutional discovery as an important reuse case. And so therefore don't typically include this sort of metadata. The other problem is that when affiliation metadata are included, they're extremely non-uniform. So what this graph is showing essentially is every permutation of UT Austin that's in DataCite for which at least one data set has been published. And so some of these are sort of weirdly formatted. They're in all caps. There's unusual punctuation. There's different words or choices of punctuation in there. And so this lack of standardization obviously creates additional barriers to institutional discovery, especially when you're at like a large public institution where people will write your institutional name 20 different ways and add additional, more granular metadata, or just type it wrong, which is a whole other problem. So we know we're missing a lot of data sets. We're missing a lot of repositories probably as well. And obviously there's a finite amount of resources. So there's going to be a challenge in there in terms of I can't develop a bespoke solution for like 300 different repositories APIs or manually get those data on any routine basis. And so even though I don't want to present this as a complicated problem necessarily, there are a lot of steps that are involved with producing high quality, in this case, affiliation metadata that a repository platform has to issue DOIs, it has to support affiliation entry. Researchers have to actually enter that information. That information needs to be crosswalked to a centralized platform. And ideally, it's going to be crosswalked in a standardized format that's been performed on the repository side of things. And there are really 2 points here. There's a lot of places for metadata to be lost if they're being recorded at all. And for folks, like researchers who maybe are really metadata conscious and think about these things and like, I really want to do a good job at this, being metadata conscious cannot overcome repository infrastructure limitations. If I go to Figshare and I want to add my affiliation, tough cookies. My institution doesn't pay Figshare 50 grand a year, so I can't add my affiliation, for example, even though I'm well aware that it's the best practice to do so. So we come back to this sort of binary that I showed before in terms of disciplinary standards and kind of where repositories fall in low quality, high quality things. what I actually kind of want to encourage folks to think about is this more in sort of a two-dimensional kind of aspect, that there's going to be general metadata along the y-axis and disciplinary metadata along the x-axis. And so, some repositories have pretty good general metadata like Dryad, but not great disciplinary metadata. Some platforms have pretty good disciplinary metadata, but not so great general metadata. And really everybody should, well, you don't want to be in the bottom left. That's where the garbage is. You want to be in the top right where that green box is, right? Ideally, the maximally fair data set is going to have good general metadata and it's going to have good disciplinary level metadata. And so I think, just in brief, again, like I said, this isn't necessarily super complicated. It's a lot easier, I think, for disciplinary repositories to add high quality general metadata than for generalist repositories to add high quality disciplinary level metadata. And so whether this is things like starting to issue DOIs, MorphoSearch doesn't always do this by default, for example, supporting affiliation entry, requiring that entry, ensuring that information gets crosswalked, and using standardization. So ROR identifiers are like ORCIDs for organizations, basically a way of disambiguating research organizations. And so to kind of wrap everything up here with sort of what are the take-home points? The first one is, wherever you sit in sort of the research ecosystem, everyone needs to make sure their affiliation metadata is good, because non-researchers are looking at it or for it, and they're going to do something with it, whether you think it's a good idea or not. Data that can't really be found easily or systematically through automated processes without knowing that they exist are going to be functionally invisible, and that's going to create sort of downstream problems for different sorts of reuse cases. Sort of like I mentioned, supporting high quality discipline agnostic metadata isn't that hard, and it's a lot easier than what I think is really the majority of the work that specialist repositories are really good at, which is supporting that high quality discipline specific metadata or data standards. And so to kind of wrap up and bring this back to MorphoBank, I think this is kind of where I see things in the research data landscape, is that these disciplinary level repositories that have already done a lot of the heavy lifting, that have developed the standards that best serve their local communities, are really best positioned to then lead in this next stage of evolution in terms of broadening some of that higher quality general metadata capacities. Okay, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, sales pitches, what have you, you can email me or social media or what have you. Happy to. I don't think we have time for questions, but yeah, folks can reach out to me if they have any.
Thank you, Bryan. And so we don't have time for questions.